New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today I am going to have an open-ended conversation with one of the leading lights in parapsychology, psychical research, and consciousness studies, Professor Ed Kelly, who is recently the recipient of the Frederick Myers Memorial Medal, awarded by the Society for Psychical Research in England for outstanding lifetime contributions to the field. That award, originally established in 1995, has only been given out 9 times since then. Ed Kelly is Professor of Research in the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia Health System. This program is perhaps the primary research center in the world looking at cases of the reincarnation type, cases of possession, near-death experiences, and the nature of consciousness. He is an editor and contributor to 3 very important anthologies: Irreducible Mind, Toward a Psychology for the 21st Century; Beyond Physicalism, Toward Reconciliation of Science and Spirituality; and Consciousness Unbound, Liberating Mind from the Tyranny of Materialism. I first met Ed when I attended the 1973 Parapsychological Association conference at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, which is where he is currently located. And now I will switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Ed. It is a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you. Finally here.
And I'm very grateful for your time. Congratulations, of course, on the Myers Award. And let's start by talking about your early years as a psychologist. I understand that You've done a lot of work, actually, and in fact received some substantial grants for looking at physiological correlates of psychic functioning, of ESP. And I'm under the impression that most people working in that field, in the field of neurophysiology, are by and large materialists. So you were deeply embedded in a materialistic culture and at the same time studying psi phenomena. Would that be correct?
I wasn't working with materialist scientists when studying psi. Those were kind of separate parts of my career, but I also did spend a big middle chunk of my career working with a somatosensory neuroscience group at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, studying touch and responses of human brains to tactile stimuli, like vibrations applied to fingertips, stuff like that. And yes, they were all good materialists, but some very good scientists too.
Well, it almost sounds as if you're suggesting that in order to be a parapsychologist, you cannot be a materialist, like with the people you worked with in North Carolina. Is that your position?
No, not at all. Actually, and we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves a little bit here, I think.
Okay.
One could do the kind of work that I've done in parapsychology without any kind of metaphysical commitments at all, whether to materialism or something else. My personal journey has been from being a young apprentice scientist, certainly a physicalist of some sort, to what amounts to almost the opposite end of the metaphysical spectrum, but driven there, I think, by data and by things I've learned along the way. So that's what we'll talk about, I'm sure.
Your latest book in the series of three anthologies talks about the tyranny of materialism in the subtitle. So that definitely suggests a particular attitude about materialism. And
Yes.
I'm very sympathetic to that point of view. I lean towards Bernardo Kastrup's analytical idealism, but at the same time, I have to say, speaking for myself, I'm not convinced that materialism is incapable of addressing the problem, for example, the problem of life after death. It seems to me there may be materialistic ways of looking at that.
Well, that certainly gets into these poorly explored subjects such as subtle energies and subtle bodies and esoteric anatomies and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Very little has really been done in that area, but I think it's clearly possible to approach it all from a scientific point of view. And maybe the answer really is what the Dutch guy Portman called Heilig pluralism. That is, that there are different types of matter. We've mainly dealt with the sort of grossest type, and maybe there are subtle types that explain some of these things. For example, birthmarks and birth defects in cases of the reincarnation type, where a kid is born with a very unusual birthmark or birth defect that corresponds to wounds that killed the previous personality, things of that sort. That's entirely up for grabs at this point.
There at the University of Virginia, where you are, Ian Stevenson has published extensively on these birthmarks.
Right. Yeah, he was especially interested in that large subset of his cases. You know, there are something on the order of 2,500 cases have been studied, and a couple hundred of them, 230 or 40, I think, have this feature of very unusual birthmarks or birth defects corresponding to fatal wounds on the previous personality. So they're certainly a challenging set of cases.
Yeah, it would appear that at some level, something physical is going on there. I wasn't even thinking of subtle energy, though, when I brought up the possibility that materialism will sustain itself. I was actually thinking about a lot of the mathematical work going on in hyperspace.
You're thinking of Bernard Carr and people like that?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's one of the approaches. Yeah, let me just say that certainly when I started out, I was intrigued by the phenomena, saw that they conflicted with conventional beliefs about the nature of reality, were therefore important, not terrifying, challenging, exciting. And like most people who come at the subject from the scientific side, I really hoped that some small adjustment in our hard-won picture of reality would allow us to explain these additional things. And it's only over a period of decades that I've gradually become convinced that once you give up classical physicalism, there's no safe place to stop short of something like its exact opposite, in which some sort of mind or consciousness lies at the basis of everything, and everything else comes from that. Mm-hmm. And we'll talk about that, I'm sure, later on at some point.
You also did quite a bit of work in J.B. Rhine's Institute in Durham, as I recall.
Yeah, well, that's where I started out, actually, against the advice of a number of people. I chose to go directly to work in a parapsychology laboratory right out of graduate school, followed by a one-year postdoc. I have to confess I spent most of my postdoc year, where I was supposed to be doing computational linguistics, instead reading parapsychology literature, and began a conversation with J.B. Rhine during that period, and was eventually invited to start up at his new institute. This is outside Duke University, sort of across town near the East Campus of Duke University. He had a clapboard house on Buchanan Boulevard That was the Institute for Parapsychology, the only division of the Foundation for Research on the Nature of Man. That was JB's organization. Yeah, and at the time I went there, I was not committed to the field. I was curious about it, and I hadn't been there more than about a month when I made the acquaintance of a guy who was referred down to Durham by one of my former psychology professors at Yale, Irv Child. This guy was a second-year law student at Yale, had become very unhappy with his courses in law school, gradually worked his way through various persons, found this Irv Child, who had developed himself an interest in parapsychology, who knew that I was now working for Rhine, and referred this person, Bill Delmore, down to us. And I actually had him living in my house for this first visit. It was about 6 weeks long, during which we gave him a lot of things to do, and he could do practically all of them, often at extreme levels of statistical success, and he pretty much erased any doubts I still entertain as to the reality of the phenomena.
If I remember correctly, Bill Delmore is the person who got all 25 cards correct in a deck of Zener cards?
No, that was Hubert Pierce, actually, with Rhine as the experimenter. Yeah, that was an old time event, but Bill did things that were rather like that. For example, well, let me just say that after this first 6-week visit, we published a paper about him, and then found a way to pay him to spend a whole bunch more time with us the following year. And we did a bunch of card experiments, for example, not Zener cards, although we did a little bit of that in the beginning. We used playing cards. Parenthetically, he would have preferred to use tarot cards, of which there are 73, I guess, and that would have been even better from my point of view, but we wanted to kind of stay away from the kind of woo-woo connotations, shall we say, of tarot cards. Playing cards are less controversial. And in a long series of trials with playing cards, he got exact hits at about 3 times chance expectation. This is over thousands of trials. Probably doing that well by chance is essentially 0. And in the course of it, there were exactly 20 occasions on which he felt very confident and told us so before we revealed the answer to him. This is with playing cards now, probability 1 in 52. And in those 20 trials, 14 were exact hits. The other 6 were all partial hits. 5 were number hits where he got the suit wrong, and the last one was a suit hit where he got the number wrong by 1. So on those 20 trials with playing cards, he was right around him every single time, basically. That's a lot better than 25 for 25 with Zener cards. Probability equals 0.2.
You were looking at visual perception using a tachistoscope, flashing the playing cards for a fraction of a second to see how his responses to those targets compared with the ESP tests in which there was no possibility of any sort of visual perception.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Jeff. Yeah, this is a often used technique in cognitive psychology to study the kinds of errors made in a task, basically for what they will tell you about the way the task is carried out. And so we did that with Bill, not really expecting very much. So we ran a parallel series where he was actually seeing the cards, but only briefly, and consequently made plenty of errors. And the errors had a kind of structure that you might expect. For example, face cards would get mixed up, especially if they're the same color and that sort of thing. And the astonishing thing was that in the ESP condition, where he's strictly deprived of access to the cards, visual access, he made astonishingly similar mistakes. Again, mixing up face cards, especially if they're the same color, and so on. And we interpreted that as demonstrating that involuntary visual imagery was, in fact, as he had told us, a big part of whatever internal process governed the responses. So when a trial began, he would close his eyes, and after a little while, he would open his eyes and make a report. And in the meantime, he told us what he was doing was observing his internal visual landscape, waiting for images to appear. And they could appear anywhere. They could be big or little, brightly colored or vivid or dull, and move fast or slowly, and that sort of thing. So he would naturally make visual-like errors of identification. But this was actually, it was that experiment that for the first time in my life made me interested in EEG, electroencephalography, as a way of, put electrodes on his head, measure what's going on in his brain. Just prior to his announcement of his response, maybe we could identify something in the brain activity that would predict success of the response. That would be a big deal in parapsychology for a bunch of reasons. Let me state a few of them. This is important because a lot of the early work, in particular in parapsychology, was directed only to showing that something unexplainable was going on. That is, there's a statistical anomaly in this person's ability to guess cards of whatever sort at levels beyond chance expectation. That's good, but it's much better if you can correlate that with something else independent of the ESP task. And in the present day and age, correlating with physiological stuff is really ideal because of the tremendous concentration of psychology now on cognitive neuroscience, attempts to study brains and how they relate to whatever mental is going on. Furthermore, if we could find some correlative success in Bill Delmore, we already have a statistical leg up in the sense that we could do another experiment, look for trials that have that characteristic with the expectation that the scoring on those trials would be better than the whole lot. And so if that worked, we would already have a certain degree of statistical control of the phenomenon. Furthermore, if the characteristics of brain activity are of a sort that we could induce or stabilize, we would be approaching experimental control, which of course is the sort of high ideal of experimental science. Could have other useful applications. For example, my favorite is Helmut Schmidt's retrocausal PK studies, in which on day one he runs his random number generator at the Institute for Parapsychology, records what happens but doesn't look at it. On day two, he brings in a subject to do the task. It's this using a device that's kind of a random coin flipper, producing ones or zeros and ones and twos, whatever. Two possible outcomes. The subject's task is to make one of those kinds of outcome occur more often than it would by chance. Now, if the person succeeds on day two, Helmut would like to say that he is retrocausally changing what happened yesterday. As a poor old psychologist, I find that extremely hard to swallow. And I'm immediately suspicious that it was Helmut yesterday who caused the beyond chance result. So it would be wonderful if we could put electrodes on Helmut yesterday and the subject today and actually determine, possibly, which one was the real subject in the experiment. This has a big history now in parapsychology, the difficulty of so-called experimenter effects. That is, that you call one person the subject and the other the experimenter doesn't mean that that's really how it is. And it's known to be a difficult problem, particularly in work with unselected subjects, and particularly if the experimenters are known independently to be good sources, it gets harder and harder to tell who's really the source of whatever happens in the experiment. I think the answer to that is to have poor psi subjects such as myself studying gifted psi subjects such as Bill Delmore. That's the best way, in my opinion, of getting around this difficulty.
As I recall, J.B. Rhine rejected the retro PK studies.
When I proposed to him that we should get interested in studying the physiology of Bill Delmore for these reasons, he refused to let me do it. And that's why I left the Institute of Parapsychology after about a year and a half and moved over to the electrical engineering department at Duke, where there were already some people who were interested in that possibility.
Did Rhine give you reasons?
Well, uh, I want to be a little careful here in what I say about JB. He was really the right person in the right place at the right time. This was still the heyday of, well, the latter part of the heyday of behaviorism. He he built and structured the field of experimental parapsychology in the U.S. during a period when it was under constant attack, really, from particularly psychologists, also some statisticians. And JB did a great deal to iron out both the experimental and the statistical procedures that became routine in his lab. And using those procedures, I mean, working them to death, really, they discovered a lot of very important stuff. They discovered things like terminal salience effects, that scores are better at the beginning and ends of runs than in the middle. Psi missing, where a target is systematically avoided. Consistent missing, where persons give consistent but wrong responses to particular targets. This would be like Bill Delmore, for example, choosing the jack of diamonds when the target was the jack of clubs or something of that sort. Other things of that sort. The sheep goat stuff was part of that early period. So a lot of good work was done. But JB had very fixed ideas about what was worth doing in parapsychology. And we argued about this. We had a series of several private meetings in which I tried to convince him of the value of what I had done and was hoping to do in terms of physiology. Could never convince him. He basically told me that I would either stop doing that or he would fire me. And that was when I moved.
But you found rather quickly a compatible group of people to pursue that line of research with.
Yeah, I had already met these people during my year and a half. John Artley was a professor of electrical engineering at Duke, and Fritz Klein was a PhD student working under John. He was actually working up in the anesthesiology department in the hospital, in Duke Hospital, developing means for telemetering 2 channels of EEG during surgical procedures in order to try to follow depth of anesthesia using EEG methods. So he was working on stuff right up my alley. And John had constructed a shielded room in the basement of the main EE building. It was an old high power engineering facility down there. It was a real, it was a kind of a bunker down in the basement. Lots of space, though, and good place for us to be. So we pursued that actually for the next almost 10 years and had developed an elegant, small but elegant system for constructing experiments and analyzing EEG data. We began to use it. We found several indications that the path we were following could be productive. During that period, I even, on an occasion where my main engineering support was away, he was accompanying a geological expedition in Africa with a Duke geology professor. He was surveying the place for oil, I think, for oil company. Anyway, while Ross Dunseith was away doing that, I analyzed a bunch of data sets that I had collected, mainly with the help of Gaither Pratt. These are high-scoring ESP data sets. And in looking at those intensively, I was able to show that in addition to the high scoring, which had always been the main focus of inquiry, I could show that the pattern of distribution of hits was itself independently highly significant. That is, you can quantify the tendency toward grouping of hits and analyze that statistically independent of the number of hits there actually are. And it turned out that in most of these gifted subjects, including in particular Bill Delmore and Sean Harabance, two guys that I was involved with, that they had very strong tendency for their hits to occur in batches. And what they both told us, and several other subjects echoed, was that, well, most of the time they just be going along like you and me, not having much luck, and they would then begin to home in on the right state for today's effort. With Bill Delmore, it amounted to trying to detect what properties of imagery were most reliable today. So the fact that hits occurred only rarely was a big help to him in doing that. With the ESP card, he didn't like them because you got too many hits by chance and couldn't sort your internal cues. So here, in what really must be the most hostile of all possible environments for such a thing to appear, I found traces of what we hypothesized was a general connection between strong ESP performance and some sort of unusual state of consciousness. And actually, Raphael Locke and he was a cultural anthropologist from Australia who had an encyclopedic knowledge of the worldwide topic of shamanism. We published a kind of pep talk for parapsychologists. It was a parapsychology monograph in 1980. I guess it was 1980. It was originally published, then reissued in 2009 with a new preface, but it's called Altered States of Consciousness and Psi. I can't even remember my own subtitle, but anyway, it surveyed the main classes of such phenomena, which include things like, in addition to shamanic trances of various kinds that Ralph knew a lot about, hypnotic trance, deep meditation, as described in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, for example, that sort of thing. Mediumship, which in the historical period was usually involved with some sort of unusual state of consciousness. I mean, Mrs. Piper, for example, wouldn't react if an open bottle of ammonia was stuck beneath her nose. And anybody who has tried that will know that she must have been in a very unusual state for that to be the case. So, and OBEs, another point of interest. We're still extremely interested in out-of-body experiences. And yeah, let me just mention, jumping ahead here about 50 years, when I finished my middle mainstream science period and moved to Virginia, having married Emily, who at the time was working with Ian up here in Virginia, my main goal was to create a laboratory facility in which we could continue the work that we had started at Duke. We ran out of steam there, ran out of money, and plus we got a new dean in the School of Engineering. This is, for those who know some of this history, this will be an interesting point. We got as our new dean at Duke a guy who had been an assistant dean to Bob John at Princeton and the Pear Lab. And this man was at Duke less than a week before it became perfectly evident that there was not going to be any of this kind of stuff going on in his School of Engineering. So that's the kind of background for all that. So we ran out of cash in about mid 80s, and that was when I had to make a turn into various kinds of mainstream activities. But when I got to UVA, we were in fact able to get some funding and begin working on parapsychology again, physiologically. And in fact, in 2007, we, in a complicated process, got a quite large donation that allowed us to acquire the space that DOPS is now in and to build within that space a really state-of-the-art EEG lab. And I'm happy to say that although I myself was not able to do as much with that lab as I had hoped, and which it could certainly service, uh, we now have a new director, my uh, self-appointed director of the EEG, the neuroimaging lab, really, at UVA, David Acunzo. So the lab is now in better hands than mine going forward, and I think you can expect to see a lot of good stuff coming out of it in the coming years.
If
So,
I understand correctly what you're getting at, that there seem to be particular altered states of consciousness
mhm.
in general, trance states, states of relaxation that correlate with high scoring.
Yeah,
And what you want to determine is if there are also specific physiological states that correlate with these altered states of consciousness.
correct. In fact, I think the prospects are much better for identifying physiological correlates of these altered states than they are for discovering physiological correlates of trial by trial psi success. And if that's the case, then I think we would have the possibility of again helping to induce and stabilize these kinds of conditions with the expectation that unusually good psi performance would come along for the ride. That was the central thesis of the monograph, which I think is still sound today. And that's
And
really the main focus of our lab going forward is that kind of work. Intensive longitudinal study with persons carefully selected either for psi performance that they're already able to do or for entering what we believe to be psi-conducive states. So anybody who happens to listen to this talk who qualifies either as a potential subject or as a potential helper, we'd love to hear from.
my understanding is that the field of physiological measurements has advanced very rapidly in recent years with the development of new forms of measuring and as well as new forms of analysis, more sophisticated mathematics, more sophisticated ways of displaying visually the activity of the brain and so on, that it's almost impossible to keep up with these advances.
Absolutely. And we're still really on a rapid learning curve, I would say. But in general, uh, electroencephalography was the earliest neuroimaging technique, and it's been widely disparaged in modern times until recently when it's kind of re-emerged as having some extremely desirable properties. For example, with magnetoencephalography, which looks at magnetic fields instead of electric fields on the scalp, it has very high temporal resolution, at least adequate for correlating with processes of human thought and perception and so on. In that respect, it's way ahead of its competitors like functional MRI and FNIR's functional near infrared spectroscopy, which is sort of a poor man's fMRI, which we now have, by the way, in our lab. We have a beginner's kit for that. And it's interesting because it directly measures the oxygenation status of blood flow in superficial cortex, but it's complementary to EEG. And yes, in general, I mean, this is a new era in cognitive neuroscience where we have the means, not perfected yet by any means, of observing what's going on in the brain in close correspondence with things that are happening in the mind. In fact, the probably an even bigger obstacle to progress at this point is the poor quality of our means for following subjective experience. But lots of people are aware of this, and there's now increased interest and emphasis on uh, neurophenomenology, meaning trying to develop ways of detecting subtle shifts in people's experience during the course of neuroimaging procedures. And David Acunzo, my successor as director of our lab, has already taken an advanced course in this from the people who have developed microphenomenology in France. So, yeah, that's a growing edge of the whole subject. Now, EEG is, I mean, it's so interesting. And of course, the great majority of neuroscientists subscribe implicitly or explicitly to the idea that everything in our minds and consciousness is manufactured by neurophysiological processes going on in our brains. I've, along with a bunch of other people in our field, have come to doubt that very strongly. I think it's incorrect. But at the same time, there is no doubt that brain activity is important. It somehow is involved with the expression of conscious capacities that may originate elsewhere than the brain itself. So the business of measuring brain activity in relationship to psi performance, for example, is a well-founded business, whichever kind of psychological and or metaphysical view one happens to hold about the ultimate relation between mind and brain. But that's what I really want to talk more about is that whole subject, because it's
Wonderful.
gradually emerged.
Wonderful, and I know you think very highly of the work William James initiated over a century ago in that regard.
Thank you for saying that. Yes, let me put it as bluntly as I can. I think that a high point in consciousness research was achieved by F.W.H. Myers, one of the founders of the Society for Psychical Research, and his colleague and friend William James by the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. And that we're just getting back now to a place where we can appreciate what they had already accomplished and go on from there. That's really been the main outcome of my work for the last couple of decades on these three books.
Let's characterize William James' model. Some people describe it as a filter theory, but I think you have a different word that you use to characterize James' approach.
Yeah. The basic idea that Myers and James shared, along with a number of other people at that period of time, like F.C.S. Schiller, Oxford philosopher, Henri Bergson, French philosopher, numerous others, picked up later by the discoverer of LSD, by Aldous Huxley, by sundry other people, is that mind and brain, although closely correlated under normal conditions, are not identical, as many people, many scientists have argued, and philosophers during the 20th century. Rather, the picture developed in particular by Myers is that everyday consciousness is not all of the consciousness associated with each of us individual humans. The prevailing picture, is that that's all the consciousness there is, supported by unconscious brain stuff. And of course, if that picture is true, then when you die, there's no possibility of anything going on. There can be no such thing as postmortem survival or rebirth. And the way James explicitly pictured this was initially in a kind of dualistic framework, where the mind is, as many dualists believe, in some sense functionally, if not ontologically, independent of the brain, and expresses itself through the workings of the brain. The brain is conceived as a kind of sensory motor organ that allows you to take stuff in about the environment and do stuff to it. And James used various metaphors for that, one of which was transmission, another of which I prefer is permission, where the conditions in the brain allow this larger, normally hidden consciousness to express itself in everyday life. The word filter came in later on. I'm not sure even who first used it, but it's unsatisfactory, really, in several respects. It's not as though everything's sitting out there ready-made and you just let that through and block everything else. I guess Huxley was one of the first people. He thought of it as almost like a water filter, where there's just a valve, and all you control is the amount of what comes through by opening the valve, different amounts, that kind of thing. That's too simplistic for sure. Permission, I think, is much more appropriate metaphor for the actual relationship there. Anyway, now James, James wrote 2 reviews really of Myers's work. James himself never was convinced of survival, at least not enough to write about it in his public professional capacity. Although David Ray Griffin, by the way, a Whitehead specialist, has recently, well, just before he died, published a book in which he argued that both William James and Alfred North Whitehead were actually convinced of the reality of survival. I'm not convinced about James. I know nothing about Whitehead. In his late work, his latest work, really, James, between about 1905, say, and his death, he began to, well, it was even earlier than that, really. The first hint of where he's going occurs at the very end of Varieties of Religious Experience. He makes clear, first of all, in several places in that book, that throughout he is using the psychological model of F.W.H. Myers. That part of VRE is often forgotten these days, but is absolutely explicit in that book. Well, in his last book, A Pluralistic Universe, what he does essentially is to take Myers's model, which holds that there is a supraliminal self or egoic self, but that there is also associated with each person a subliminal self, capital S, which is the supraliminal self is totally embedded within that larger self, which has various kinds of capacities of its own that exceed those of the everyday self, and that include in particular capacities for psi phenomena, mystical experience, and creative genius. That's the source that Myers and James agreed of these higher capacities of human beings, which have largely been ignored by modern science. What James does in that last book is he proposes to expand on that and conceive, with Fechner in particular, the possibility that there are higher levels of integration, still higher consciousnesses independent of us, and ultimately a highest consciousness of some sort. And James he hedges his bets right in there. He's talking in 1909 in England to a bunch of idealists. Idealism was still a very prominent metaphysical position at that time. And a lot of their descriptions of the highest consciousness were repulsive to James. He speaks of things like the unintelligible pantheistic monster. This was Bradley's conception, and several other idealists of the time. He wants something that is way bigger than us, but not that big. Something that's like us enough for us to relate to it. James is clearly struggling to form his own conception of some kind of highest being that we can relate to as though to a god, but that's more scientifically plausible. Now, I've talked about this at some length in chapter 14 of our middle book, Beyond Physicalism. Anybody who wants to look into that, that's a good place to get it. So that's where they were. And of course, Myers died in 1900 and James in 1910. And James's body was barely cool when John B. Watson published his famous Behaviorist Manifesto, 1913. Psychology as a behaviorist views it, or something of that sort, which is, in retrospect, the most astonishing, horrifying document. Every psychologist, every philosopher should be required to read it, I think, because it basically said, let's have no more talk about things like consciousness or mental imagery or emotions or anything, any kind of internal experience. Psychology is to concern itself henceforth only with correlations between stimuli and responses, period. And I mean, to read this stuff now, it's shockingly primitive, and yet possibly propelled by kind of envy of German science in particular, psychometrics, that sort of stuff. It really had a kind of death grip on the field of psychology for the next 50 years.
And I suppose the logical positivist movement had something to do with it.
Oh, sure. Yeah, these things all sort of blended together. And even when I was a graduate student at Harvard in the 1960s, a guy as sophisticated as W.V. Quine in the philosophy department was most closely associated with B.F. Skinner in psychology and saw that as the proper kind of metaphysically austere approach to psychology. On the other hand, there was Noam Chomsky over in the linguistics department at MIT. And like many other people, I sat in on a couple of his courses. One was on what he called Cartesian linguistics. He published a book about it around 1964. And, well, the scene, here's this Quonset hut. There are about 200 people in there, and of whom literally about 10 were taking the course. The rest of us were just there to sit at the feet of Noam Chomsky. At some point early in the course, somebody asked him, I forget the context, what he thought of experimental psychology. And his response was that, I mean, he waited a moment. He sort of chucked his chin a little bit and said, I think the first half century of American experimental psychology will end up as a footnote in the history of science. I mean, there was shock throughout the room. People literally gasped when he said that. But I think we now know that he was pretty much right about that. I mean, it's of interest to historians of psychology, but it's long since disappeared from the psychological mainstream. So, and that's the environment in which I entered graduate school, where cognitive psychology was just coming over the horizon, something new finally, and that certainly on the surface seemed a whole lot better than what had preceded it. This was the computational theory of the mind, basically, analogizing digital computers to brains and minds to programs that ran on those machines. And there's a lot of deep theory behind that picture of things, which not many people have looked into. I spent a lot of time in it in those early days. It goes into Turing machines, theory of computability and all that sort of thing. Provides a very strong justification for that general approach. And a lot was done, and it's still going on today. In fact, we are now in the middle of the fruition after, 70 years or so of work on artificial intelligence. Let me just say, I think we are now seeing the first really serious experimental test of artificial intelligence, and that there is no such thing as yet as artificial general intelligence, nor will there ever be. And that's not just my view. You can see similar attitudes expressed from different points of view by people like Noam Chomsky, Roger Penrose, most importantly right now, Federico Fagin, who we should talk about at some point later on, who invented the Silicon Gate junction and cannot be dismissed as an outsider to the subject of computers and artificial intelligence, and who feels very strongly that they understand nothing. They can do a credible job of imitating people who understand something, but they themselves understand nothing.
You mean the computer understands nothing?
Correct.
Not the researchers who are studying the computer.
Right. I should have made that clear. Yeah. And I personally believe, well, let me go back. Let's go back to my passage through graduate school. I did my dissertation research on a system of automated content analysis called the General Inquirer. Phil Stone was my advisor. And this was a system to do various kinds of social sciencey tasks like, analyze published documents for such and such characteristics that might predict something about what some country would do in some situation or whatever. And it had some moderately useful applications of that sort. Everybody realized that it would do a lot better if the system could distinguish the main senses of high frequency words in English. It turns out that something like 2,000 dictionary entries account for over 90% of all the actually occurring words in any average kind of text as a general rule. So if we could develop routines for those words that would identify their main senses, we could possibly make a big improvement in the quality of content analysis. So we set out to do that. We created a corpus of about 500,000 words. I mean, this is kid stuff now, but at the time that was a huge undertaking. Generated a keyword and context listing of the whole thing. That means every single occurrence of each word occurred together along with about a dozen words or so of context on either side in these printouts that collectively filled a small office, a huge amount of paper. And from those, we knew which words occurred in what frequency order, and we proceeded to work our way down from the most frequent to as far as we could get, creating little computer routines to scan the context based upon this corpus of data and try to guess which sense was actually there. And from a practical point of view, I'd say it was a reasonably productive exercise. It went on for years. I was the director of that project. But for me, the main outcome was to convince me that the computational theory of the mind was fundamentally flawed, in that what became evident through this corpus from looking at thousands and thousands of uses of ordinary words by ordinary citizens for ordinary purposes, it became clear that what really underlies the use of language is the capacity of human speakers to grasp concepts and to apply them in novel but appropriate circumstances, including, in the extreme case, metaphorical circumstances where the application is literally wrong but metaphorically correct and conveys understanding of some novel situation. So I wrote a book based on my dissertation, chapter 4 of which is called Some Problems of Word Meaning, which focuses primarily on this, which I saw then and continue to see today as a fatal flaw in the computational theory of the mind, and that this ability to grasp and use concepts is intimately connected with the possession of consciousness, which machines do not have, period. So, well, when I was in graduate school, I had expected to go on, with this computational theory of the mind stuff. And here I was kind of devastated by this discovery. And it was right about that time that I got a call one day from my mother telling me that my sister had become a medium. This was a call on a weekday afternoon, which is something my mother never would do. It was clear right away she was very concerned about this. And hoped that as a graduate student in psychology, I'd know all about it and could reassure her. Well, I had to tell her I really didn't know anything about it. And it was at that point, really, that I went off to the library. And for the first time, I vaguely knew that these things existed, but I'd never looked at any of it. Discovered that William James had spent a big part of his adult life involved in the area and so on. I'd read most of the principles and I'd seen him, allude to it a little bit, paid not much attention to that aspect. Anyway, so it was really at that point that I became interested in parapsychology and began to read. I mean, here were a whole bookshelf full of journals, refereed journals, in which people were reporting results obtained by the same kinds of methods that I'd been taught to study ordinary subjects in psychology, showing that things that the prevailing picture said shouldn't happen were in fact happening. I found that to be exciting and interesting. That's why I contacted J.B. Rhine, and that's how I ended up at the Institute for Parapsychology in the first week of 1972.
So there you were at Harvard University, and even though it was relatively hidden from the psychology students at the time, Harvard had a history of looking into this phenomenon going back almost 100 years.
That's right. In fact, I was living at the time in William James Hall, built in his honor. And I'll bet there were many hundreds of people worked in that building. I bet there were 10 that actually knew anything about James's involvement with psychical research or about psychical research. And most of the people who did know something about it were quite hostile. In particular, Fred Mosteller, who was the chair of the statistics department, who I learned most of my statistics from early on. And he had a student, postdoc at the time, named Percy Diaconis, you may recall from parapsychology. He's one of the main early skeptics.
Yeah.
He wrote an invited paper for Science at a time when Fred Mosteller was the president of the AAAS, an invited paper on statistical problems in ESP research, including my research with Bill Delmore, in which he never said a word about the actual experiments and the reports of those experiments, except to say that the reported experiments seem beyond reproach, and then proclaimed to know that something different must really have happened.
Rhine faced that sort of opposition constantly, and I can say, speaking for myself as a graduate student at Berkeley, at the time, there was a statistician who invited himself to join my committee and then informed me that his role was to be a hatchet man to make sure I never received a degree in parapsychology.
Wow.
But he was very explicit. He said that I'm here as a hatchet man. You're not getting through. I reported that to the dean of the graduate division because every time I turned in some experimental work, he would simply say it's incompetent and I don't have to say why. It's just totally incompetent. And it got me and the rest of the committee so frustrated that we went to the dean, and the dean issued a ruling that if he critiques your work in statistics and he won't say why he believes your work is incompetent, then I'll remove him from your committee. And that's what happened. Or I never would have graduated.
Wow. What an experience.
Yeah.
That's possibly the worst I've ever heard, actually. Certainly up there with the worst.
Yeah. Yeah, but the field has faced that kind of intense opposition really from the beginning. William James complained about it bitterly.
Yeah, thus runneth the world away. Yeah, and now we have the astonishing spectacle. In 2018, Edsel Cardania published in American Psychologist, the flagship journal of the American Psychological Association, an excellent survey, meta-analyses of 10 or 11 different areas of psi research, showing clearly to anybody who has the slightest degree of openness to the subject that, hey, a lot has been accomplished over the decades in parapsychology. The very next issue, at the beginning of the next year, supposedly coincidentally, an article appears by two psychologists, Reber and Alcock. Alcock is a well-known, long-time psi denier. I won't say any more about it. But
He's been
Um,
interviewed twice on this channel,
oh, okay.
and I will say we had a cordial relationship.
Anyway, these two psychologists first uh, do what many people do, blame us for not having a convincing theory of our phenomena.
Yeah.
But then went on, as psychologists, mind you, to declare that not only do we not have such a theory, but we can never get one because the phenomena are ruled out by the laws of physics and impossible, and therefore nobody needs to pay any attention to any of this evidence. I mean, that is truly astonishing in this day and age that anybody could get away with that sort of behavior. I mean, they don't even acknowledge the fact that a large number of physicists, including some Nobel Prize winners, have taken a great interest in the subject for the same sort of reasons that it challenges our conventional understanding. Uh, I mean, it's just, well, this is one of the reasons why I have come to believe that finding a theory that can potentially explain, in some sense, yet to be determined, psi phenomena, and that is not demonstrably inconsistent or might even incorporate in some way leading edge physics, foundations of physics, would do more to advance the subject of psychical research than any amount of additional evidence collecting. We can disagree about that, but there's no doubt that finding a good theory would go a long way toward strengthening our position scientifically. And that's really what my work has been mainly involved with now for the last couple of decades. And yeah, let me just say, we're not there yet, for sure, but I believe we have found an opening. Um, yeah, let me say a little bit more about how this came to pass. A book was published around 2020, I think 2021, maybe, by a man named Tim Eastman. Timothy Eastman is a space plasma physicist. That's his background. But he's also been a very prominent figure in the world of process studies, stemming from Alfred North Whitehead. Sort of a mob of books and papers in that area. And what his new book does, it's called Unsnarling the Gordian Knot, Untying the Gordian Knot. I mixed it up with a book by David Ray Griffin of almost the same title. Untying the Gordian Knot. What he does in that book is to sketch an enlargement of the customary framework of scientific activity, taking into account improved versions of Alfred North Whitehead's process philosophy, plus more modern developments in physics, logic, math, biosemiotics, several other subjects. There are 8 chapters in this book, and in chapter 8, he explicitly states that he hopes that the framework, the expanded framework for science that he has set forth in this book, will ultimately allow us even to explain phenomena of the sort cataloged in the book by Ed Kelly and Company called Irreducible Mind. And on that basis, I was then invited to be a discussant of Tim's book. He had a series, chapter by chapter discussions, and I was a discussant for chapter 8 and 7, just because of this possible connection. And that began a collaboration that is ongoing. It's gone through a couple of stages already and is going to undergo a much bigger one this summer, in which we are attempting to find ways of grinding down the space between his very abstract conceptual framework for science and the kind of picture, scientific and metaphysical picture that we have developed in the course of our 3 books, coming mainly from the side of psychology and neuroscience. And I think we have found an opening, and without trying to get into it in too far down into the weeds, the opening is provided really by a subset of quantum theorists, that is, people who are actively involved in exploring the foundations of physics, who want to build on the ideas of Werner Heisenberg in particular by elevating a realm of potentiae to ontological parity with the actual.
Mm-hmm.
Most other interpretations of quantum theory unconsciously import a lot of essentially metaphysical assumptions about how things are, in particular actualism, the idea that reality is what we experience and that's all there is. And it's in this realm of potentiae, now elevated to ontological parity with the actual, that Tim Eastman and several other persons, some of whom you know already, I'm sure, Bernard Carr, for example, Ruth Kastner, maybe. She's the transactional interpretation, now the relativistic transactional interpretation of quantum theory.
She has been interviewed several times on this channel.
Wow. It's really a wonderful thing that you've put together, Jeff. It's astonishing. I've not made as much use of it as I should. I would love to spend, 6 months, which is probably what it would take to just watch them all.
It'd probably take a lot longer. I think we have 2,000 videos at this point.
2,000. Oh, wow. That's a real accomplishment. Congratulations. Anyway, where was it? Okay, so this is the path that we see opening, and now we're trying to actually trod that path and start to flesh out some of the details of how this could be done.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, there are some other things. Well, yeah, let me say first, the kind of picture that we came to first through Irreducible Mind, then beyond Physicalism, where we actually looked at a bunch of systems, old and new, that take psi phenomena seriously and attempt to provide a conceptual structure that might permit them to occur, and then to see if we could discern the kind of characteristics held in common by these dozen or so pictures. And what we arrived at, described in chapter 14 of Beyond Physicalism, is something called evolutionary panentheism. And again, without getting too far into the weeds of these things, panentheism is a kind of theological position in between traditional theism, as in the monotheistic traditions, of a God who's sort of independent of creation, gets it all going, and may or may not have anything to do with it thereafter. Pantheism, in which God is identified with actuality, and there's nothing left over. Panentheism is kind of in between, in that it posits a God who is within everything, and yet there's something left over, just as our minds are something left over from our bodies, which we occupy as minds. So there's that analogy at the base of it. And a highest consciousness, which, Kant talked about noumena, a noumenal realm that is inaccessible to us. Schopenhauer argued that, and later German idealists, that maybe we can access it through mystical experiences and that sort of thing. One of the main things coming out of all the work that I've done for the last couple of decades is the realization that our modern Western civilization is unique in world history in the degree to which it has systematically ignored, particularly in its modern form, things like not only parapsychology, psi phenomena, and so on, but mystical states of consciousness, which I now believe do in fact provide windows into normally inaccessible parts of the real. And it's only when we begin reabsorbing that into our way of thinking about reality that we're going to arrive at a proper metaphysical understanding. But to the extent we've arrived at any conclusions, it goes in that general direction, that there is some kind of a highest consciousness which lies at the base of everything, out of which everything else is manufactured, including the reality that we experience ourselves as occupying. That's a big mouthful, and it remains to be fleshed out. But it's this kind of a realist idealism that I think we're being driven to, which is essentially the metaphysical opposite of what prevails today, and what has, I think, not only arguably, but definitely led us where we are, to the edge of a precipice where we're going to kill ourselves if we don't change our ways fundamentally and come to grips with things like the climate problem, like the threat of nuclear holocaust, all the rest of it. All the prevailing characteristics of modern civilization are commodification of anything, the driving of everything that happens by money, the internet, taking over the internet by advertisers. I mean, God almighty, we all know what we face. And I think it's clear that the prevailing physicalism has a lot to do with that. And that part of my hope for finding a way forward is to overthrow that pernicious doctrine in favor of something that is just a lot better for us as human beings, both individually and collectively. So that is my sermon for today, and I'll not say any more about that.
Well, I am under the impression that something happened in about the 17th century or so in which my friend Stephen Schwartz says it all started at the Council of Trent, where a decision was made that the church would be responsible for realms of the spirit. Mm-hmm. And as long as scientists strictly maintained a Galilean approach and looked at physical matter and nothing having to do with consciousness, then the two domains could get along with each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I'm not sure about that Council of Trent business, but that's basically what happened with the founders, Galileo to Newton and so on. It was kind of a methodological decision to, okay, let's put all that mental stuff over here for now and concentrate on things we can measure. And that was tremendously productive and led to the rapid advance of physicalist science, which, by the way, I mean, let's not pretend it hasn't been a huge success in many ways. It's an extraordinary achievement. And yet, what had started out as a helpful methodological decision somehow metastasized into a very pernicious metaphysical doctrine. It's philosophy, not science, this physicalism stuff. It's an austere philosophical descendant of the some looser materialism of earlier centuries. Certainly, most of the founders of modern science were very religious people themselves and saw no fundamental conflict between science and religion. In fact, if anything, Newton was a bit bit over the top in terms of his occult interests, right?
Deeply interested in alchemy, we now know.
Sure.
Which would imply an openness to the entire Western esoteric tradition.
Yeah. Which is still there, it's still lurking around the margins of our civilization. And basically what I see having happened was that we threw out the baby with the bathwater, and we are now in the process of trying to rescue the baby and help it grow up in the context of our modern civilization. You know, a lot of people who agree about the pernicious effects of, the rise of scientism and secular humanism and all that, want to advocate for some kind of return to something pre-modern, but I don't agree with that, certainly. I don't want to complain about anybody's religion, but I don't think any of those are the answer. I think we have to find some new system still based in science, which makes room for spiritual experience and psi and all the rest of it in a way that traditional religions did for thousands of years.
And that's where the philosophical position you've labeled evolutionary panentheism comes in.
Yeah. I mean, we don't want to found a new religion, with our own Bible and, churches and all that kind of stuff. But that's what we're looking for, is an expanded, still science-based picture of reality that can speak to those parts of our human nature that have been really suppressed in this modern period by the disenchantment of the world through classical science. And science itself is driving this, which is the novelty, which I think will allow it to succeed. The kind of picture of this evolutionary panentheism stuff, it's come up repeatedly. Well, it was in the Oriental traditions mostly from thousands of years ago. It's come up in the modern West repeatedly and always kind of subsided again. There have been, I think, one of the real drivers right now in the public sphere, by the way, is the explosion of interest in near death experiences. I think of deep near death experiences as mystical experiences that occur under suboptimal circumstances where you almost have to die in order to have the
Yeah.
experience.
Hmm.
But it's the mystical experience aspect. It was prominent even in the 60s through psychedelics.
Yeah.
Lots of people had big time mystical experiences that changed their lives, often made them into better people. I mean, you can look both within the NDE literature and the broader literature of mystical experience to see that most people who are fortunate enough to have these kinds of experiences are made into better people by having had them. They become more human oriented, less egoistic, more interested in things of real value and less interested in the stuff that dominates contemporary values. So that's where it's headed. That will certainly be a part of it. And by the way, I think from my point of view as an experimental neuroscientist, cognitive neuroscientist, really, that's my home base. I think we have the task ahead, which we could easily share with somebody who's still a materialist, is to study and find out things about these conditions in the brain that permit the expression of these normally unseen capacities, whether we interpret them metaphysically in the way that my colleagues and I have, or in some, expanded physicalist manner, doesn't matter in the least. That's something we know how to do, and I feel sure that the time will soon come when lots more people will be able to access these kinds of experience, and probably should.
Hmm.
For example, through things like meditation, maybe aided by biofeedback, through maybe improved forms of psychedelics, maybe through a study of, I mean, we can do a lot more in terms of scientific study of mystical experiences. They're still happening all over the place, probably a few million every year. Just to people and study them, learn more about them.
Let's talk about the default mode network in the brain.
Yeah. Um, let's see. My first uh, contact with this came in the context of chapter 4 of Beyond Physicalism, where David Presti is a neurobiologist at Berkeley, who's also a world-class expert on psychedelics. He and I wrote this chapter on possible physiological aspects of psi phenomena. Well, not just psi, but also creativity and mystical experience. We put it in that larger context. And while nobody has any very detailed answers as yet, we ended up in that chapter hypothesizing that this default mode network is very likely one very important piece of the puzzle. What this thing is a system, a network of brain regions, mostly midline, that collectively seem to represent the neurophysiological embodiment of everyday consciousness. When you're just kind of sitting there, resting, feeling yourself, maybe idling, mind wandering, that sort of thing. And what is becoming clear is that in many of these kinds of states involving psychedelics, meditation, certain kinds of mediumistic type trance, there is a marked suppression and disruption of the activity of that particular network in the brain. Now, that's only part of the story, we think. but it may be an essential ingredient, and it corresponds to what Myers and James talked about as, well, Myers put it specifically in terms of the emergence of the subliminal in proportion to the abeyance of the supraliminal. I mean, that's a Myers type analogy to what you learn about on day one in meditation, which is your goal is to suppress all the customary internal chatter and then allow something bigger to come in. So that's, I'm sure, part of it. And, I mean, the first really interesting neuroimaging study of psilocybin occurred in 2012, was reported in 2012 by Robin Carhart Harris and his colleagues from England. And it was shown they combined injected psilocybin with two kinds of fMRI, which had better time resolution than imaging methods that had been applied previously. And the remarkable thing was that during the period of intense psychedelic experience, some of which clearly got into that mystical territory, there was no increase in neural activity anywhere in the brain, and the most prominent thing was, in fact, this sharp reduction and disruption of activity in the default mode network. And that basic finding, it came as a real shock to a lot of neuroscientists, including in particular Christoph Koch, K-O-C-H, the principal student of Francis Crick, principal materialist scientist of the 20th century, now deceased. If only we could hear from him again.
I did interview Crick back when he was alive, when he published his book, The Astonishing Hypothesis. And I have to give him credit because he made a point of saying that religious traditions could be correct. He says, for all we know, survival after death might occur.
Really?
Yes.
Oh,
I have it on videotape.
I'll be damned. Well, let me tell you something. I don't know if we should include this or not, but I mean, Christoph Koch has been vocally, publicly moving in a direction parallel to ours for some time now.
Mm-hmm.
And I have seen an email he wrote to a mutual friend of ours in which he says he is moving irrevocably in the direction of idealism.
I interviewed Christoph not long ago, and I have on tape him saying that he never considered himself a materialist.
Really?
Yes, that he was always at odds with Crick on that point.
Huh. I must watch this. I actually had a dialogue going with him a while ago by email. And the subject of idealism had come up, and I had sent him a essay review that I wrote about Harold Ottmanspacher and Dean Rickles' book, Dual Aspect Monism and the Deep Structure of Meaning.
Yeah.
And he wrote back to say he agreed with pretty much all I had to say about that, but why hadn't I said anything about IIT, Integrated Information Theory? At which point I sent him my review of Integrated Information Theory that I published in Edsel Cardena's JAEX journal. And Koch broke off the conversation at that point. Not that he explicitly broke it off, but he's never written me since. So
he's a strong proponent of that theory. Yeah.
And it's a hot potato. You've noticed, I'm sure, that this extraordinary event where 100 and something scientists got together and wrote a letter to Nature, I guess it was, demanding excommunication of IIT from the academy.
Yeah, that almost is like the scientists who wrote a big document they all signed against astrology.
Exactly. Yeah. Alex Gomez Marin is very involved in this. And there's apparently going to be a new issue, may already be out, of Nature Neuroscience, in which the whole subject is revisited. And Alex Gomez Marin and Anil Seth, who's a determined physicalist,
Yeah.
a very smart guy. They've gotten together and written a paper talking about how neuroscience and consciousness science should learn from this experience what to do and what not to do and all that. But it
Mhm.
was perfectly clear right at the beginning when this happened that, I mean, apart from some sort of obvious personal jealousies and stuff like that, there were clearly people who were offended by the whiff of metaphysical heresy that they detect in IIT. Daniel Dennett, for example, was one of the original signatories.
Well, it shows the strength of this implicit materialism. I think you described it as something people just absorb without even thinking of it because it's so
Yeah.
dominant in the culture. And I can't help think that ethical materialism and metaphysical materialism seem to be related somehow.
I feel right now more optimistic than I ever have before in my career that the winds of change are really beginning to blow. And I have to say, it's in large part, I think, because of the difficulties that neuroscience and philosophy are having with consciousness. You know, it used to be that we were in this little rowboat trying to steer the Titanic and not having very much success, but now there are at least some other boats, some bigger than ours, in the same territory trying to push in the same direction. And I think that's really fundamentally changing the dynamics. And as we all know from history, things can change in a hurry once some kind of a tipping point is realized. We may be closer to that point than we are currently even aware. It may already be happening. You know, things in culture change not like mathematical functions all at once at a exact moment in time or whatever.
You mentioned earlier the work of William James and his colleagues was something of, I think you used the phrase high watermark
Yeah.
in the field
Yeah.
of psychology, and we're approaching that high watermark again.
Yes. Yeah, I think we're right about there actually, and now much better equipped really to carry the subject further, both psi research and consciousness research. In fact, I think what's going to happen ultimately is that psychical research will be reabsorbed into consciousness research as one element of that larger subject. And I think the consciousness researchers, particularly the ones who see the difficulties from a physicalist point of view, are really helping us. And there are some other things that are happening that are feeding into the same development. One, for example, is the recent organismic turn in theoretical biology. You know, for a long time, biologists have aspired to explain everything about life in physicalist terms, you know, particularly with the rise of molecular biology and all of that. But there's now a real return to things that were being argued even by William McDougall in 1910 in his book, Body and Mind, that the real model for what's fundamental is the single-celled organism. Even at that level, you can see signs of mentality present there, possibly even some kind of glimmer of consciousness. Who knows? That point of view is returning. Hans Driesch was a big advocate of it. Michael Nahm is a guy now in psycho research who knows a lot of this history. This organismic development plugs right into our general picture of things. So we're working toward a possible book 4, which will certainly include that dimension. The other thing that took me by surprise is that there has been a kind of renaissance in natural theology. You know, natural theology kind of went underground or was banished from most mainstream conversation, you know, 100 years ago at least. But it's really revived in the last few decades, and there are a bunch of really smart people who are reviving old arguments or inventing new ones to support the idea that there is some kind of highest being. Now, some of them are very invested in a particular version of that highest being. Others are more general and ecumenical and much closer to where we would be coming from the scientific side. So there's that. That's another thing that's kind of feeding in the same direction. Yeah, and let me reiterate one thing here I really like to direct people's attention to. Of all the people that I have been working with who are advancing models of the general type, this evolutionary panentheism stuff, the one that appeals to me the most, I just feel in my gut that he's on the right track, is Federico Fagin. He's got a chapter in our third book, Consciousness Unbound, which kind of
Yeah.
summarizes his point of view. There's a figure in that could have come, except for the quantum theory aspect, so it could have come straight from Myers. He's got the really essential thing that we have inserted into the picture through psychology and neuroscience of the higher consciousness, possibly at several levels. There could be several stages intermediate between us as individuals and the highest level of integration. That's all there in Federico's picture. And he is trying to do it in a way that is compatible with, and indeed even incorporates in some sense, the latest in quantum theory. So he's one of this group of people that I've been working with to try and fill in that space.
I have two interviews with him so far on New Thinking
Okay.
Aloud, and hope to have more. It turns out that one of Federico's closest colleagues at the Zilog Corporation, building the Z80 computer chip, was one of my best friends when I
Oh,
lived in San Francisco. So I feel a real
wow.
kinship with him.
Uh-huh. How good. Yeah,
Yeah,
Federico is a force.
he is.
And my God, he's immensely productive. I mean, that guy, his writing program, he writes like 12 hours a day,
Mm,
7 days a week.
yeah.
And he's maybe a year younger than I am, which is 83.
You've alluded a couple of times so far to Alfred North Whitehead, and
Yeah,
under the impression, from what little I can grasp of his philosophy, it's relatively complex, that it is organismic in its focus.
definitely. In fact, it's even called by that name sometimes. This was a guy, I mean, he is certainly one of the monumental intellects of the 20th century. He's a guy who understood classical physics in depth, understood certainly relativity theory, had a version of his own. He was certainly aware of what was going on in quantum theory, saw perfectly clearly that these developments are fatal to the prevailing physicalist worldview, and set out to invent an expanded conceptual system that would embrace the new developments in physics and also provide for all other aspects of human experience, including even stuff like paranormal stuff. It's He's very quiet about it. By the way, I spent some time trying to find out if he had any interactions with, the Cambridge psychical researchers. They were there at the same time. He must have known about them. Apparently, he had a large amount of personal papers that he instructed to be burned at his death. And I would almost bet that somewhere in there was stuff about his connections with people like Sidgwick and Myers and the physicists who were members of the SPR during that early period. Anyway, so that's what he did. And he was an extraordinarily deep thinker. He invented a lot of new ideas, expressed them in ways that are often very hard to understand. I mean, I've had the same experience that others have reported, that you can go for pages on end and wonder, what the hell is this guy talking about? And then suddenly come upon a passage that is so stunningly lucid that you can't help but think maybe all those other passages were equally lucid, but I just didn't get it. You know, I mean, he's that kind of a person, unique. And he had the great misfortune to burst upon the scene. I mean, here's a guy who spent most of his life in mathematics and mathematical physics kind of stuff, co-author with Russell of the Principia Mathematica. It's said that the first philosophy lecture he ever heard was the first lecture that he gave at Harvard when he was already 65 years old or something like that. So it's in the last part of his life, really, that he develops most of this philosophical thought. And it was at a time when, the logical positivists and all that were burst upon the scene, Alfred Ayer and Language, Truth, and Logic, and all the stuff that and there was a general revulsion among professional philosophers for grand metaphysical schemes of the sort that Whitehead elaborated. So I think, he was kind of suppressed during his lifetime. People ignored him. That still goes on today. I remember calling a friend, a logician at Brooklyn College, and asking him what he thought about Whitehead, and he just kind of sighed and said, "We don't pay much attention to things like that anymore." And that was it. Professional philosopher. But I think he kind of led the way in that, as Tim Eastman has shown, an updated, revised, expanded version of something like Whitehead's organismic picture may be the path to follow.
Well, Whitehead and his work with Bertrand Russell came to the conclusion that they were unable to provide a logical basis that could account for all of mathematics. At the same time, you have, I believe it was Eugene Wigner, who talks about the improbable accuracy of mathematical systems in describing physical reality. So what we see here is a system that does not have a logical foundation, yet is incredibly accurate in describing the physical universe. It would seem to me there's an important paradox there.
Well, I'm not so sure, actually. And this is one thing that I share with Harold Ottmanspacher, by the way, who is a guy I respect enormously. Mm-hmm. Part of his, it's a small part, but a part of their book on dual aspect monism explicitly suggests that the explanation for something like the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, Wigner's description of it, could lie in the character of this normally hidden realm, which they talk about in terms of the unus mundus and all that, the supposedly neither mental nor physical, the ontological foundation of things in their scheme of stuff. We have the same idea, basically, that this hidden realm, which underlies everything, including us individually and the environment we find ourselves in, the patterns in ourselves and in the world around us are related inherently. And that's what allows mathematics to function so well. Myers had hit upon an example. Myers wanted, in his chapter on genius in his book, Human Personality and Its Survival of Bodily Death, he talks about how he had hoped to learn a lot about mathematicians and their creativity and so on, but there wasn't anything available really at the time, and he concentrated instead on savants, calculating prodigies. Often little kids or adolescents, like Dace, I think, was one of them, who could just do stuff like glance at a big complicated window and tell you how many panels were included. Subitizing, that's one of the skills. That's a skill that Bill Delmore had also, by the way. I mean, I've never published anything about this, but it made a big impact on me. When he was living in my house, he used to eat Cheerios in the morning. He liked Cheerios. And one morning he poured himself out a big bowl of Cheerios, and I, just for the hell of it, I said, "Bill, how many Cheerios do you think are in that bowl?" And he said something like, "I'm 493 or something like that." Anyway, I counted the damn things, and he was exactly right. And this was a case where you couldn't even see them all. I mean, some are hidden under others. So subitizing and psi are pretty close together in the human psyche. Oliver Sacks has a chapter in The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, I think it is, on the twins. These are two adolescents, autistic kids. They couldn't add or subtract single-digit numbers with any consistency. And Sachs was trying, in his beautiful way, really, to get a sense of their internal world and so on. And at a certain point, he knocked over a box of matches that was sitting on a table. So these matches dump out on the floor. And the two twins immediately said in unison, 111, 37, 37, 37. What was that all about? So anyway, Sachs heard the 111 and he counted them. And there were 111 matches on the floor. Now, subitizing normally is good to 4 or 5, maybe tops. So right away, these twins had done something quite amazing. What Sachs goes on to talk about, however, is the 37, 37, 37, because what they had done is they had factored 111 as the product of two prime numbers. Well, once he realized that, he began to challenge them. He reminded them of 111 and then got them to begin exchanging bigger prime numbers. And they soon exhausted his published table, which went only to like 10 or 12 digits, and went on to as long as 20-digit ostensible prime numbers, which he had no way of checking. But 10 or 12 digits is good enough to make the point. I mean, these are things that we compute laboriously with computers, not persons. And yet these kids who are, defective at the most basic level of arithmetic could somehow produce these damn things. How could they possibly do that? And the closest anybody's come to an answer, I think, is that they were somehow just visualizing, that they were just there in some kind of a space that they could wander through and just read them off of some internal tablet or something of that sort. Anyway, so that's an example in a very peculiar, sort of isolated territory of psychology of how there's a kind of vent hole, I think is a term that Myers himself used, between the supraliminal self and the level of the subliminal self, where these things somehow exist in a form that is accessible under conditions that we ought to be able to find out about, but haven't yet.
In other words, you're suggesting with regard to mathematics that there's a Platonic realm that some people are able to access.
Most pure mathematicians tend strongly in that direction, starting from Plato on. Roger Penrose is a modern spokesman. And, to me, it conjures things like Plotinus's idea of an intelligible realm, which is kind of his version of a Platonic realm of forms. I think something like that may literally be a component of reality, maybe down in this space of potentiae, and that some people in some states can directly access it.
I'm sure you're aware of the Telepathy Tapes podcast and the work of Diane Hennessy Powell with autistic savants who, in her view, demonstrate remarkable psychic functioning comparable to what you saw with Bill Delmore.
Yeah. I'm aware of that. I haven't really studied it, but I have an earlier encounter that inclines me to take it seriously. I was friends for a while with a guy named Bernie Rimland, Rimland. He's a psychologist. I'm
familiar with his work. He is one of the early writers on the subject of autism.
Yes, he had an autistic child, which led him to have an interest in that subject, and he wrote a book titled Infantile Autism, which got a big award from the APA in mid-60s, or I think it was 60s. Even.
When I was an undergraduate psychology student, it was widely discussed.
Yeah. Anyway, he, in a couple of his publications, he does mention a couple of cases of this sort, and I talked to him about those cases in some detail. He came to visit us at Duke when we were working there. He was a good guy. He got entangled with the vaccine controversy about autism, relying very heavily on that guy in the UK whose work has been I mean, it's all been retracted now. I forget his name. He was one of the main sources of um, supposed scientific papers about the connection between autism and vaccines.
Hmm.
I still think it's quite possible that there are, particular cases in which particular vaccines interacted with particular kids at a particular stage of their development in a bad way. But as far as I know, a general connection between vaccines and autism is widely disputed in the psychiatry world, anyhow. Anyway, so the intelligible realm, or the realm of Platonic forms, including goodness, truth, and beauty, perhaps may resurface here in modern science.
It might be something that could be integrated into evolutionary panentheism.
Correct.
Well, the evolutionary part of that phrase does suggest what some people refer to as the great chain of being, kind of a hierarchy of levels of consciousness.
Yeah, the great chain of being is, of course, kind of a synchronic description. And evolution, of course, is diachronic in the sense that it takes place over time. But the suspicion is that it's this great chain of being, the synchronic part, really has something to do with the diachronic part. And there's certainly increasing openness now to that among evolutionary biologists as well. There's a space has opened up between the classic neo-Darwinian synthesis and intelligent design. For example, there's a guy named Perry Marshall, Evolution 2.0, I think is the title of the book, in which he, as an amateur interested in the subject, pulled together a wide variety of evidence for a more subtle, nuanced conception of evolution, and has gotten several real evolutionary biologists to agree with him that this kind of a picture is probably more correct than the currently prevailing one. Dennis Noble, for example, a biologist in the UK. So there are developments in that area.
I guess in terms of evolution, some people have described mystical experiences and as sort of a regression to an infantile state. Freud took that position, but I'm under the impression that the evolutionary panentheism model would imply that actually it could represent a future evolution of the human being to a more evolved state than present modern humans.
Yeah, I'm very much in sympathy with that point of view, and that was very much Myers's point of view. Myers talked, I think, a little prematurely about how we continue our evolution in the postmortem state. I don't think we really know much of anything about the postmortem state, if there is one. I'm inclined to think there probably is. I think, we haven't gone very far, but even to open the door to the possibility that some of us, for some period of time, under mostly unknown conditions, persist following bodily death, alters the nature of the real world in a fundamental way, makes it radically different from the world that's portrayed in most contemporary science and secular humanism, certainly. The secular religion of the day.
Well, since you bring up Myers and the question of postmortem survival, I wrote a foreword to one edition of his book, Human Personality, in which I highlighted the communications that ostensibly came from Myers after his death, which were quite extensive, including several books, apparently dictated through the automatic writing of her name's on the tip of my tongue.
Geraldine Cummins.
There you go. Geraldine Cummins, the Road to Immortality, supposedly a book dictated by Myers and endorsed by his friend, Sir Oliver Lodge, a great physicist. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, it's interesting you bring this up. Yeah, I read The Road to Immortality many years ago, and I was kind of surprised actually that Lodge was so positive about it because it really did not seem all that Myers-like to me. On the other hand, he was talking about different things, and I had previously heard him talk about. That could account for some of it. But this is an area in which some interesting research can really be done. Um, and there are statistical procedures have been worked out to resolve issues about authorship.
Mhm.
For example, my teacher, Fred Mosteller, and some others, I think he worked with his former student then at Princeton, Tukey, John Tukey, and some other people, studied the Federalist Papers, where some are known to have been written by Hamilton, others by Adams, etc. And anyway, they worked these procedures out and made certain determinations or provisional determinations as to who really had written the ones that had been uncertain. Apart from the details of all that, what's interesting is that the measures that really helped are things that would not leap out at someone who was consciously trying to imitate someone's style. They were things like the frequency of usage of articles and pronouns and stuff like that. Very high frequency words and uh, you know, turns of phrase. People will. Um, yeah. Anyway, so they worked out some of the mathematical basis for that. Now, I had discovered um, this was back around 1982 or three. There was a completion of Dickens's last novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood. There were a number of completions. Most of them had been written by Dickens scholars who tried to use their knowledge of Dickens to predict how it would be finished. One came through a medium, guy up in Vermont or someplace. And I got hold of that and I read it and I thought it was remarkably good. And I even took it to a guy in the English department at Duke and asked him to read it. And he came back saying, yes, it really was very Dickens-like, except that it seems to me a little more characteristic of the younger Dickens. Of course, lots of times people encountered post-mortem are thought to be younger editions of themselves and things like that. So that was all quite interesting. I never could proceed with the project. Well, turns out there's a guy right now who is working on that, along with some other things, including the Cummins-Myers personalities, trying to compare Myers in human immortality with Myers in other settings and that sort of thing. No definite results as yet, but that's certainly a worthwhile kind of approach and one that has not been used as much as it should so far.
Well, in addition to having ostensibly dictated a couple of books through Geraldine Cummins, Myers apparently was, from the afterlife, instrumental in initiating this lengthy program of cross correspondences. I know it's been studied by Trevor Hamilton and others, and it's extraordinarily complex, but there are certain instances that seem to be very striking. Just simple communication, such as Myers providing an address to a woman in India so that she could contact the Society for Psychical Research and let them know that she thinks she's in touch with Myers.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's really extraordinary stuff. Alan Gould actually provided to DOPS many years ago a complete copy of the cross correspondence. It's about 30 volumes altogether.
Yeah.
And Trevor Hamilton has, I think he's got them all in digital form of some sort. So, these same authorship techniques could probably be applied to some of that stuff as well. One of the best introductions, by the way, I encountered early on was Gardner Murphy's book, Challenge of Psychical Research. He's got a big section on survival which talks a lot about the cross correspondences, and he really knew that stuff thoroughly. He picks out some great cases and describes them in detail there. It's a wonderful introduction to that subject, and relatively short, painless.
So I gather you're taking basically a wait and see attitude towards the idea of Meyer's disembodied consciousness.
Well, Balfour's report on the sittings with the soi-disant Myers and Gurney by Lodge and himself are one of the most impressive documents I've ever read from the proceedings of the Society for Psychical Research. That account is a 1946 paper, I think. Here, let me quick look it up. Balfour.
You're talking about, I think, Gerald?
Yeah.
The brother of the former Prime Minister of England.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah, here it is. 1935, a study of the psychological aspects of Mrs. Willett's mediumship and of the statements of the communicators regarding process. That's an absolutely wonderful document.
Mm.
Yeah. Some of those old SPR investigators were really just off the charts, able people.
Well, now, since we're on that topic, I'd like to go back for a moment, at least, to William James, because I read William James' essay carefully, in which he evaluates the ostensible communications that came through Mrs. Piper regarding the death of James' friend, Richard Hodgson. And
Right.
As I read that paper, which was published in the Proceedings of the SPR, James basically said, if I wasn't communicating directly with Hodgson, then it would have been an impersonator from the afterlife, or an impersonator from the cosmic reservoir of knowledge. So he seemed to be acknowledging, if not survival, at least he seemed to be acknowledging it had to be some sort of non-physical entity he was in touch with.
Yeah, that's right. There's some sort of Hodgson-like something in the universe that she was in touch with. It's not far, really, from Mrs. Sidgwick's report on Mrs. Piper, also published in the Proceedings of the SPR. I won't bother to look it up, but it's about 700 pages long. They wrote really long papers in those days.
Yeah.
And she was persuaded that she was writing in particular about GP at that point. This was the this was the communicator that had really convinced Hodgson himself of the reality of survival.
George Pillow,
who had died in a fall, and Hodgson, in his typical way, would bring people into seances with Mrs. Piper, who he had followed around by detectives and all that kind of stuff, make sure she wasn't cheating. And some of them had been acquaintances of GP in GP's actual life. There were, I think, 32 of them, right, altogether. And all but one, clearly the soi-disant communicator, clearly recognized all but the one, and the one had been a little girl when he knew her, so it took him kind of a while to catch on there. Alan Gauld has revisited all this in a book he published just before he died, actually, about the heyday of psychical research. I don't have a copy here. I can't show it. Anyway, that was just absolutely great stuff. I mean, not only the information communicated, but the style in which it was sometimes communicated, the verisimilitude of the simulation of the deceased person. Hodgson was just not prepared for that and became convinced and very adamant and very combative in his typical way about the reality of survival.
Which was in some ways a surprise, because Hodgson had previously shown himself to be a skeptic, even a hostile skeptic to Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophical movement.
Yes. Yeah, that's still a somewhat controversial episode, but the society had been kind of flirting with theosophy at that point. Myers was very attracted to it for reasons you can easily imagine. I mean, theosophy as a doctrine, in general terms, has much in common with the kind of picture that we're developing. And Myers
William
was
Crookes
developing.
became a theosophist.
Who did?
William Crookes.
Interesting. Anyway, and then of course Hodgson went over there, and his role as the exposing the cheating that he thought was going on. And of course, scholars of religion have taken a pretty dim view of Madame Blavatsky and the later theosophists as well. That they relied a lot on subpar translations of ancient Indian documents and stuff like that, Tibetan masters and blah blah. It's a very complex subject in its own, and Hodgson may have overdone it, but I think probably he was correct that Madame Blavatsky is perhaps not the best representative of those traditions, which do have a good bit in common. In fact, I think we're recovering now something like it in the context of contemporary science.
In fact, yes, the work that you're doing, the evolutionary panentheism, is in some sense comes out of the same impulse that inspired theosophy.
Yeah, we even have chapters on Patanjali and Kashmir Shaivism in Beyond Physicalism.
We've covered a lot of ground here, Ed, and maybe this is a good point to stop him. Is there any other topic you'd like to delve into?
Yeah, I'd like to convey, particularly to any young people who see this, and maybe professional people who are at sort of decision points in their careers, wondering whether they would venture to get involved in this field. I think we're at a really exciting place in the historical development of psychical research, where it is converging with other big topics in psychology like consciousness, and where big changes are about to happen in our collective view of these matters. So even though things are still pretty tough in terms of the normal resources, hard to get grants, especially from government sources, you still attract a lot of hostility from entrenched defenders of the prevailing picture. But I think we're really right at or very close to the tipping point where this is going to become fashionable and mainstream, and people who pursue it, despite the risks, should be congratulated for making the right decision under difficult circumstances. Yeah, I've said it before, and I'll say it again. I think future historians and philosophers and sociologists of science are going to make a great living trying to figure out why it's taken science so long to catch on to the reality of the phenomena that we study.
Well, Ed, I'm very grateful that you were able to take this time with me today, and for the courage that you demonstrated throughout your career in exploring these controversial areas and integrating them in many different ways into our mainstream intellectual culture. Thank you so much for being with me, Ed.
Well, thank you, Jeff. I appreciate the opportunity. And I'm sorry again it's taken me so long to get here.
Well, it's well worth the wait. Let me say that. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us too, because you're the reason that we are here.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy, go to newthinkingaloud.org